All right, this is now part 5 of the Telecaster student build that we've been working on. And for those of you not familiar, this is a video I'm doing for my students at a local college within their lutherie program. And I've got 17 students that are learning to build the very first guitar as either a Telecaster or a Stratocaster is the goal. And last episode we inserted fret markers into the top and sides of a couple necks that I've been building in this video series. These are going to be used in a couple Telecaster bodies. And at school I've been working on with a demo neck for more of a Strat, 22 fret Strat style. And this next class I'll be installing the frets on that. But we're going to take this video the next step. And the next step here is to radius the fretboards. Before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about bridges. If you're building a Telecaster, I mean, there's really a couple different ways you can go, but the very traditional would be with the barrel style saddles. This is called an ashtray style. They have more contemporary that don't have the sides on there, that may have saddles that look more like a Fender Stratocaster style. So there's a lot of different ones you can do. This would be a Stratocaster, very typical. This one is a Wilkinson. But it's a tremolo base that's got individual saddles that can go fore and aft, and certainly they can adjust up and down. Now that becomes a pretty key point that I just wanted to touch on, because remember, today we're talking about radius in the fretboard. And in class, a lot of students are talking about different things. Oh, I like a 10-inch radius. Oh, I want it to be really flat. I want it to be a 20-inch radius, and things like that. And everybody certainly has their preference. But you have to begin to think about what type of saddle you're going to use. For instance, some people may decide to get a little bit creative, and instead of using a more traditional Stratocaster or Telecaster type saddle, they may want to use more like a Les Paul configuration with a tune-o-matic bridge system and a tailstop. Well, I've got a couple examples. Here's a pretty traditional one here, and the traditional one has got all the little individual saddles that are adjustable fore and aft, but they do not adjust up and down. All right, and that becomes a little bit of an issue. Now, I did measure it with my gauges, and this is approximately a 14-inch radius. Now, I've got another one here. This is called a rolling saddles. These are actually adjustable left-right. This is a Schaller product. And they also have a 14-inch radius to it. They are not adjustable up and down. Now, when we compare these two with something more traditional in the Telecaster or Stratocaster realm, both of these saddles are adjustable up and down and can almost match the radius, whatever you choose, of your fretboard, so that the string has continuity of clearance all the way down the fretboard to the saddles themselves. You can really tweak these more traditional Fender products. Now, the one that is just a standard saddle that has a notch in each one of those saddles, theoretically you could make this tighter than a 14-inch radius by filing those notches down a little bit so the strings sit a little bit lower. So you can make these so it's a lot closer match to the radius of the fretboard. The Schaller product here is very cool, especially if you're going to use a tremolo, for instance, like a Bigsby on it. The rolling action really kind of helps it stay in tune a lot better than the friction that is provided, through a notch. So we have different options, and the only reason I bring this up is because sometimes when you are making your choice of what radius you want on the fretboard, it is wise to compare it to what the radius capability is of the bridge system that you're going to be using. And again, if they're pretty traditional Fender, you have a wide range of flexibility there. But if you're using one that does not, like I've got a hip shot piano bridge, I believe, or baby grand bridge, I think it's called, which is pretty cool. Look that up if you need to. But that's got 11.5-inch radius. So if I wanted my fretboard to be a 16-inch radius, that's really not going to work. So that's where your decision making comes into play. So for what we're going to do on the guitars here, the two Telecasters necks that I'll be building bodies for, one of these, I am going to use a Tune-o-matic type product on there. And for that particular neck, I am going to try to match to a 14-inch radius. Now, I could do an entire 14-inch radius all the way down, but I could also do like a 10 to 12 to 13-inch radius, a compound radius, and then that would extend out and flare out to the 14, and that would probably be a pretty good fit too. So I may do that with the one that I'm going to be putting that bridge on, which actually is this one here. On the other one, I'm going to use a more traditional Telecaster style bridge plate that has the adjustability. So in this one, I'm going to go a little bit more vintage because I can match that radius. So I'm going to use a 9.5 on this Telecaster neck, and I'm going to use maybe a compound 10 to 13, transitioning to that 14 by the time it gets to the scale line at the bridge. So that's going to be my technique here. So it really doesn't matter a huge amount, and you can get by with mixing and matching some because we're talking about such minor changes. The negative result is going to be maybe you can't get as low of an action than if you have a perfectly matched radius from the neck to the bridge. And that may or may not matter to you based upon your comfort of string height and your style of music that you play. Okay, so for the primary Telecaster neck that we're working on this series, and I talked about doing a more traditional, because it's going to have a traditional bridge, Telecaster bridge on it, a traditional radius. I'm going to do this one at 9.5. So what I've got here is a sanding beam. Okay, the radius sanding beam, this one is already designed and set for a 9.5-inch radius. So this is the one that I'm primarily going to use. We've got other radiuses that we can use. There's a standard 12-inch, which is very a common radius for fretboards. It's not necessarily my goal to teach compound radius either in this video or in the class that I'm teaching, but it's really not that much different, although it will take you 3 to 4 times longer to do it. Because what you'll have to do for instance, if you want a 10 to 14 compound radius, a pretty common compound radius, you're probably looking at using 3 different sanding blocks, a 10, a 12, and a 14. And you would use the 10 here, you'd use the 12 in this area, you'd use the 14 down there, and you'd work that down. And then when you get it all done, then you'd have to take a flat sanding beam and work that back and forth to bridge together all of those 3 different radius so it becomes one continuous blend. And you'll have to continually check it with radius gauges to make sure it's right, and you'll have to make sure that you're not sloping off one side or the other. It is a little bit more tedious of a process. Still very doable for anybody that's dead set on that, but it will take you more time in order to not only do it, but to make sure that you do it right, which is the key, right? Doing it right, taking your time, not getting in a rush. I'm talking to my students for anyone who's listening, but that's the key right there. The other factor is you can spend all day here with just a radius beam. So typically, you don't really want to go and do all of the work by sanding alone, especially if you're doing this 9.5-inch radius, because it is going to take you a long time to get it down there. So what I'm going to start doing is showing you a technique where we can combine tools together to make it easier. We can use the radius beam to determine where the high spots are, and then we can use tools like either a block plane, highly sharpened, hopefully, that's the key to success there, or you can use different files then to begin filing the wood away. The thing that you have to be careful of is not too aggressive of a file or have a plane that's not sharp enough, because our fret slots are already installed. You could very easily get chip out, and this is already the final dimension of what we need, so we really do not want to get chip out in these at all. We're going to get this set up and show you one way to do it by utilizing multiple tools. If you certainly want to take a sanding beam and do the entire thing with that, You know, that is your preference, but it will take you significantly longer if you're sanding alone. All right, I've got the neck in my clamp, and the first step I want to do is to determining high spots is to actually just mark this thing up, and I'll just run the silver pencil all the way across from one side to the other. Doesn't have to be any specific fancy pattern. I just need to know from side to side when I'm taking material off and where the high spots are. Okay, so once I have that all marked up, here's what we can do. We can then take a sanding beam and we can begin to work this. Now this is a 12-inch sanding beam because I want to show you something. Now I can work this for just I don't know, 10 strokes, let's say. Work it back and forth. And what will happen is you will begin to see where it's beginning to sand off the very edges, and that's telling us that these are pretty significant high spots. So we could actually take these all the way off very rapidly by taking something like a hand plane. Now the hand plane, again, it needs to be sharp, and you should only take a slight slicing action. If you go the wrong direction, you could chip this out, and I really get kind of uncomfortable about doing this, specifically if it's in woods like ebony, okay, because that has a tendency to chip more. All right, and you have to make sure that you don't get any chip out here either, because that can get pretty tough. What I'm going to do is shift gears here, and I'm going to start using files. And I can use the files working out to in. That way it's not chipping away, it's got wood backing it up, and I can begin working this off. So this is a razor file from StewMac. Does a pretty good job at this. It kind of like really tiny razors, and it just kind of shaves that wood. And just we continue working that back. Just taking that edge right where the lines were removed, and we're taking that stuff off. All right, now the other type of file we have is called a dragon file, and it's a little bit more aggressive. It'll cut faster, but surprisingly, this is my favorite file in the whole wide world, because the dragon file has kind of a hand-stamped, basically cutters on there, and the randomness of it seems to cut aggressively, but yet not prone to tear out. It seems to cut smoother. So I can work that down. And I try to work in linear strokes, but pushing in the entire way. So again, I don't have chip outs by going out to where there's no wood backing what I am filing off. Once I've worked this a little while, and I feel like I've worked that high spot pretty good, I'm going to repeat the process. I'm going to make sure I've got lines all the way to the edges. And then I'm going to go back to the radiusing beam. Now the reason that I'm using the 12 here, the 9.5 that I ultimately want is a tighter radius. The hard thing about using it like this is I really have to make sure the radiusing beam is straight on the piece of wood, or you can begin to create offsets where it's kind of falling off one side because you had more pressure one place than another place. And that gets a little bit tricky. So I want to pull you over here and show you this technique. So another technique to use these sanding beams is to actually clamp it down to a table and then use the neck on top of that, because now I can see and I can use my fingers as a guide left and right, and I can get a little bit more constant pressure and make sure that my strokes are perfectly straight. All right, and then that will give us a little bit better result. by doing it that way. So that's just a technique. You can do it that way or not do it that way. So once I've identified the high spots, I'm going to go back over and I'm going to use my drag and file to continue taking down those outside edges again. I'm trying to work it off so that it's consistent, so the edges that I'm removing on either side are consistent with the left and right side, the bass and treble side of that fretboard. Okay, now if you look at this, we're getting to the point now where we only have a high strip that is almost vanished in the front and maybe a ½ inch wide in the rear area. So I can start lightening up the pressure on the front side and try to increase it everywhere else to try to work the edges down. So I'm going to focus on the widest part of this at this point. And I'm going to take more off this section than the front section and the headstock area there. We've got all of the lines out of the center section. We've got all out of the tail section. We pretty much have them all out of the front section. There's just a little bit here and a little bit there. So those are the areas that we have to focus on continuing it down. Now I am so close at this point in time that I think I'm going to switch to the sanding block and see if I can't take that last little bit of radius down purely with the sanding block. All right, so let's see how that works. Yeah. Now that just only took me a couple minutes sanding after I did most of the work with the files. And you can see that there is no more silver lines in the center. So I have got this right on that 9.5-inch radius. All right, so we can take our radius gauge and we can hold it up to anywhere on the fretboard, and we're going to be pretty much right on the money there. I don't know if you can see that, but that's the idea. So at this point, we do also want to make sure that we're trying to keep it as parallel with the fretboard, so you're not taking off more of one area of the fretboard than the other, and it does look pretty parallel to me. So I'm going to then take it up from 80 grit on my sanding block to 120 grit on my sanding beam, and I'm just going to work left and right in equal strokes across, basically only to take the scratches, the 80 grit scratches, out of the wood and my synthetic stone that I have as my fret markers. Once I feel good about that, I can switch over to 220. And then lastly, I'll go up to 320. I'll go all the way up to 800 grit, the fretboard, which will be the next episode, by the way. We will cover fretting. So don't worry about it. So after we've got that sanded down right now to about 320 grit, I just want to double check. I checked with the radius gauge, right, with a 9.5-inch radius, and I had pretty solid contact all the way up the neck. So the other thing I want to do is get down here and make sure I've got the absence of light as I work from one edge to the other edge, kind of parallel to the center line. And we do. You can't see it from your angle. It would be very difficult to show on camera. But we have the absence of light underneath that straight edge all the way along there. So I know that we are rock solid on this radius. The last thing that we are going to do is just take it up to 800 grit. 400 will be the first one, and I'm just going to lightly sand off all of the other marks. I'm not taking a lot off at this point. I just want to kind of finish the wood a little bit, because this is going to get an oil treatment instead of, you know, an actual coat of lacquer or urethane or anything like that. So I just want to very lightly, very consistently work my way back and forth. It's not moving a lot of material, so I'm not going to alter the accuracy of that, but that's what I'm going to do. The other thing I should mention is you want to stay nice and flat. You do not want to round these edges at this point in time. If you prefer to have rounded edges on your fretboard, we will do that after the fretting process has taken place. Here's the 800 grit. All right, I'm just going to wipe the fretboard down with a little bit of naphtha. It's a cleaner, but it also kind of gives you an appearance of what it's going to look like after it gets an oil finish on it. And this fretboard is looking pretty good at that 800 grit. All right, now that we're done the 9.5-inch radius on our one Telecaster neck, I want to bring up a point, and I've mentioned it before, but just for repetitive sake, whenever you're doing sanding with some of your fretboard material, like the rosewood or the ebony specifically, if you're using Padauk or any other type of wood like that, try to save as much of this stuff as you can, because you just never know when you're going to do something that's going to require a repair. And so it doesn't help that I have holes in my table, but that's for a different purpose. But I can still collect most of it, scoop it up. So there we go. Don't have to buy rosewood sawdust. You create enough of it. Okay, for this other neck, I'm going to show you a little faster way to do this. I have shown it in other videos that I've done in the past. And I normally wouldn't do this because I'm trying to use only the tools that are available to the students at the school where I'm teaching this class. However, I've got a fretboard radius sander, and you've probably seen it in other videos out there, I'm sure. But we're going to go ahead and do this radius, because remember, we're going to do compound, and we're going to go with a 14-inch radius bridge down here. We want to kind of work from 10 to 12 to maybe 13 and then end up at 14. So I'm going to go from 10 to 13 compound radius on this particular neck because it's going to be paired up with a 14-inch radius tunematic style bridge. All right, so we've got the apparatus set where we've got a little over 10 inches from the sander to the pivot point, and then we've got a little just under, well, actually right on 13 inches from here to the pivot point. So now we've got our basically 10 to 13 inch compound radius conical that we are going to be creating here. Everything else is going to be the same. I'm going to draw my pencil lines with my welder's pencil because it's nice and clear and easy to see on the darker wood. And now we're going to take the neck that is fastened to the bottom of this, and we are just going to slip it in. All right, and now I've got it adjusted so that it's just barely touching the bottom consistently all the way across. Now we'll come and get the sander going, and we'll rock it ever so gently. Now I have found with this sander that I don't pull it all the way up and out of the sander because it tends to round over the corners just a little tiny bit. In theory, it shouldn't do that. So I'm just going to rock it only as much as I need to get to the edges and no more. And that's going to be the secret here to success. All right, so what we're looking at here is we've got no lines left up at the nut side, and we've got maybe 1.5 inches left down here, but it's pretty symmetrical in what we've sanded off on either side. So it's looking good, but at this point, the only side I'm going to adjust is this side and bring that down further, and then it'll begin to work this. Again, I want to keep the edges perfectly parallel, so I can adjust it by after I take my lines and see what is sanding the most. I can adjust one side and not the other side, and that'll get me right where I need to be. So that's the radius sander that I use on most of my necks. You can see doing it by hand is not all that difficult, but you can see how the time would add up. If I just wasn't talking and I went right to it, that would have been probably 15 to 20 minutes to radius this. Maybe a little less. Maybe I could get down to 10 minutes if I was really, working pretty hard. But even at that, even if you think 10 minutes, and legitimately this one was about a 3-minute process, I'm saving it at least 7 or 12 minutes. Right there on every single neck that I do. So that sander is kind of a real cool thing to have when you're looking to especially do a lot of necks, or maybe even those compound necks, because a compound neck on this guy would have probably taken me at least 3 times longer, so 30 to 45 minutes, let's say. So big difference between 3 minutes for compound radius versus 30 to 45 minutes. So that's what we're looking at a different piece of equipment. Now, the only reason I showed that sander, because I have made a recommendation to the school to purchase that one with some upcoming grant funding that they're looking to secure. And so I think knowing that that is a possible machine that the school will have will be encouraging for those of you that are looking to take the advanced electric guitar class next semester. If you do a straight radius here, and next semester you want to do a compound radius, hopefully you'll be able to do it on that machine. So anyway, that is radiusing. And if you got any comments, certainly leave them. Don't forget to subscribe. Click the little bell icon so that you get the proper notifications of when I post a new video. And until the next episode where we actually are going to work on the fretting, that's all we've got today. So remember, no matter what you do, start with excellence.